The road into Stavalo ran black with oil and red with fire on the morning of December 19th, 1944. A king tiger sat crooked across the cobblestones. Its turret cracked open like a broken jaw. Smoke poured from the hatches in slow, greasy columns. The number painted on its flank was still readable through the soot. 222. 70 tons of German steel, killed in a Belgian town square before most of its crew had time to climb out. 2 days earlier, an American tank crew 20 miles east had watched 3 Sherman tanks die in 90 seconds. The German gun that killed them was mounted on a King Tiger. The Sherman shells that answered it bounced off the front armor like handfuls of gravel thrown at a locomotive. The last Sherman commander to climb out alive burned to death anyway, before his crew could pull him free from the turret. That was what a King Tiger did to Americans. Nobody killed a King Tiger. That was the rule of the winter of 1944. That was the rule every American tank crew in the Ardennes understood, the way they understood the cold in their boots and the fear in their throats. Somebody in Stavalo had just broken the rule. To understand how a King Tiger died in a Belgian town square, you have to understand what came before. You have to go back to the autumn of 1944, to a chain of tank factories in Detroit and a chain of tank factories in Kassel, and to 2 very different answers to the same terrible question. The question was this: how do you kill a tiger? By the fall of 1944, the Sherman tank was losing. American crews rolling east through France and Belgium were running into German armor that their guns could not defeat. The Panther, sleek and sloped and lethal, could shrug off Sherman's 75 shells at any reasonable range. The Tiger, older but heavier, was worse. Sherman gunners fired, watched their rounds bounce, and died. The math was cruel, and it was simple. American shells could not penetrate German armor. German shells could penetrate anything the Americans had. Something had to change. The answer came from an unlikely direction. In the American arsenal, there existed a weapon designed to kill airplanes. A 90mm anti-aircraft gun, long-barreled, high velocity, capable of throwing a shell over 6 miles into the sky. Engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground looked at that gun and asked a different question. Could it kill tanks? The answer was yes. They took the chassis of the M10 tank destroyer, ripped out its old 3-inch cannon, and dropped in the 90mm. They cut the roof off the turret to save weight. They welded on counterweights to balance the enormous new gun. What they built was not a tank, it was something rawer, something meaner. A gun on tracks. A cannon looking for something to kill. They called it the M36. The Ordnance Department gave it the publicity name Jackson, but the crews who fought in it rarely used that name. They called it the Slugger. They called it the 90. Some of them just called it the gun. The first 40 M36s reached France in September of 1944. On the 30th of that month, in the mud and rain of the Siegfried Line, a unit called the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion began trading in its old M10s for the new machines. The commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Fred Merriam. His men were mostly boys, 21, 22, 23 years old, from Michigan and Oklahoma and Tennessee, farm kids and factory kids who had crossed the Atlantic to find themselves standing in the freezing German rain, staring at a machine that looked like someone had bolted a lamppost to a coffin. They climbed inside. They looked up at the open sky above the turret. Somebody laughed. Somebody said, "We are going to freeze to death." Somebody else said, "If we are lucky." That autumn, in a training area called Sennelager, deep inside Germany, another unit was receiving new machines of its own. This unit was called Schwere SS Panzer Abteilung 501. Its commander was a 33-year-old SS officer named Heinz von Westernhagen, a veteran of the Eastern Front who carried a shrapnel fragment in his skull from a wound taken years earlier. The fragment gave him headaches. The headaches gave him a temper. The men under him were afraid of him for reasons they did not always share. The machines his men were climbing into were King Tigers, 70 metric tons of armored monster, a gun so long it looked wrong on the hull, frontal armor 185 millimeters thick on the turret face, 150 on the glacis, numbers that no Allied gun in the field could reliably defeat. The crews called it the Königstiger. King Tiger. King of Tigers. When it rolled on flat ground, the earth trembled. When it fired, windows broke a mile away. There was one problem, and the staff officers of the 501st knew it. They wrote it down. They sent a report up the chain to SSAH command. The report said that the roads of the Ardennes region, narrow, forested, twisting through hills and river valleys, were unsuitable for a vehicle weighing 70 tons. The report was passed to the officer who would command the operation. His name was Joachim Peiper. Peiper was 29 years old. He was blond and photogenic, and possessed of the kind of surface charm that made older men trust him and younger men worship him. He had been Heinrich Himmler's personal adjutant before the war. He wore the death's head of the SS the way another man might wear a wedding ring. He had killed on the Eastern Front. He had burned villages. He had been decorated for actions that were, by any standard other than the one he served, atrocities. He read the report about the roads. He set it aside. He said that his Kampfgruppe would move where it was ordered to move, and it would move on schedule, and the King Tigers would move with it. On the 16th of December, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, the German artillery opened fire along an 80-mile stretch of the Western Front, in the Ardennes forest, snow-covered and silent for months. The ground began to shake. Wacht am Rhein had begun. Kampfgruppe Peiper moved through the American lines like a knife through wet paper. Peiper drove hard. He drove faster than his fuel could follow. He drove past prisoners without stopping to process them, and past objectives without stopping to hold them. His column stretched for miles. Panthers and Panzer IVs and half-tracks, and at the tail, the huge shapes of the King Tigers of the 501st, straining their engines on hills the roads had never been built to carry. Somewhere near a crossroads called Baunez, on the 17th of December, a group of about 130 American soldiers, mostly artillery observers with no combat experience, ran head-on into the point of Peiper's spearhead. They surrendered. They were herded into a snowy field. A German officer named Werner Poetschke was present. What happened next has been argued in courtrooms for 80 years. What is not argued is this. When the shooting stopped, more than 80 American soldiers lay dead in the snow, a tragedy that would forever stain the Ardennes campaign. Wounded men crawled through the bodies of their friends and played dead as SS troopers walked among them, firing pistols into skulls to make sure. Some survived by lying very still under the corpses of men they had joked with an hour earlier. When darkness fell, they ran. The news reached American lines within hours. The message that went out to every unit in the sector was simple. The SS is not taking prisoners. Do not surrender to Peiper. The war in the Ardennes had a different rulebook now. The 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion was ordered south. They loaded their M36s onto transporters and moved through the night, headlights taped down to slits, engines running on fumes because the fuel trucks could not keep up with the emergency. They rolled into a village called Werbomont on the 19th of December. Snow was falling. The wind cut through every layer of wool they were wearing. In the open turrets, they stamped their feet and waited for the sound of engines they had never heard before. They knew what was coming. What they did not know, what almost none of them had been told, was what had happened at Aberdeen and at a firing range near the Siegfried Line only days earlier. The 703rd had conducted its own test firings. They had wanted to know, before the battle, whether their new guns could kill what was coming for them. They fired 90mm armor-piercing shells at the estimated equivalent of a Tiger II's frontal armor. They fired at every range from point-blank to 2,000 yards. The report was written. The report was filed. The report concluded, in the flat, bureaucratic language the army preferred, that the frontal turret armor of a Tiger II remained a formidable challenge for the 90mm gun, demanding that crews seek flank shots to ensure a kill, at any range, with the ammunition available. Not at 1,000 yards, not at 500, not at 50. The gun could not kill the tank from the front. The men of the 703rd did not read that report. They did not need to. They already knew. Word traveled through tank destroyer units the way it always travels, whispered from crew to crew over cigarettes and coffee. And by the time the battalion rolled into Werbomont on the 19th of December, every gunner and every turret understood the shape of the problem. They were going to fight King Tigers. Their guns could not kill King Tigers from the front. Their vehicles had no roof. Their armor was thinner than a Sherman's. The temperature was 20 below zero. The enemy was killing prisoners. Somewhere across the snow, out beyond the tree line, engines were running. Big engines. Maybach, throaty and deep. The sound of 70 tons of steel moving on frozen roads. The boys from Michigan and Oklahoma and Tennessee stood in their open turrets. They wrapped scarves around their faces. They loaded their guns. They were going to have to find another way. The other way was old. Older than the M36. Older than the King Tiger. Older than the war itself. The other way was to shoot a man in the back. Every gunner in every tank destroyer battalion in Europe understood the principle. If you could not punch through the front, you moved. You waited. You let the enemy come to you, past you, through you, and then you fired into the side of him. Into the engine deck. Into the ammunition rack. Into the thin steel of the turret ring where the whole rotating mass met the hull. The manuals called it flanking. The crews called it something less polite. On the morning of the 19th of December, in a small Belgian town called Stavelot, that principle was about to be tested against a King Tiger for the first time in the Battle of the Bulge. Stavelot sat astride the river Amblève in a bowl of hills. A stone bridge crossed the river. Stone houses climbed the slopes above it. It was the kind of town that had survived 4 years of German occupation by keeping its head down and its shutters closed. On the morning of the 18th, Kampfgruppe Piper had crossed the bridge with almost no resistance. By the afternoon, American engineers and infantry from the 30th Infantry Division had begun to fight their way back into the town from the west. By the morning of the 19th, the streets were a knife fight. A King Tiger with the number 222 painted on its flank was moving up one of the narrow streets that led away from the river. The tank commander was scanning for targets. His gunner had the turret slewed forward. His driver was watching the cobblestones for the treacherous patches of ice that could throw a 70-ton machine sideways into a wall. None of them was watching the alley to the left. The gun that killed Tiger 222 belonged to an American tank destroyer of the 30th Division's attached armor, waiting in the shadow between two stone buildings with its 3-inch barrel aimed down the street. Its crew had watched the Tiger come around the corner. They had held their fire until the flank of the tank was exposed at almost point-blank range. The gun fired. At a range of less than 300 yards, the shell went through the King Tiger's side armor and into the ammunition. There was a flash inside the turret. Smoke boiled from the hatches. The tank rolled a few more feet on momentum alone and stopped. The engine ran for another minute. Then it stopped, too. The first confirmed King Tiger killed in the Battle of the Bulge was not killed from the front. It was killed by an American gunner who understood that 70 tons of armor is only as strong as its thinnest plate. Word of it traveled fast. By nightfall, every American gunner in the sector knew that the 90mm could do the work if you could get an angle, and that even the 3-inch could do the work if you got close enough. The lesson was simple. Do not fight the King Tiger from the front. Wait for him to turn. Wait for him to expose his flank. Wait for him to come to you. The men of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, moving south through the snow, were about to receive the same lesson under harder conditions. Their war began on the 20th of December in the village of Stoumont. Stoumont was a strip of houses along a ridge above the Amblève Valley. Kampfgruppe Piper had captured it on the 19th. American troops of the 30th Infantry Division and the 740th Tank Battalion had counterattacked. By the 20th, the fighting had turned into a house-by-house grinding contest that neither side could break. Into that fight rolled the M36s of the 703rd. The road up to Stoumont was narrow and wet. On either side, snow-covered fields fell away to stone walls and fences. The M36 crews moved slowly, buttoned as low as they could get in their open turrets, faces black with cold, listening. The gunners kept their hands on the traverse controls. The drivers kept the engines in low gear so they could stop instantly. The first King Tiger they saw was on a curve in the road ahead, hull down behind a stone farmhouse. Only the turret was visible, only the front of the turret. 185mm of Krupp steel angled toward them like the face of a cliff. A gunner in the lead, M36, lined up his sight. He knew what the report had said. He knew what the 90mm could and could not do. He also knew that not firing was not an option, because behind him were the men of his platoon, and behind them were the men of the infantry, and behind them, somewhere in the snow, was a road that led all the way to Antwerp. He fired. The shell struck the turret face. Sparks. A cloud of snow. Nothing. The Tiger's own gun began to traverse toward him. The M36 reversed. The driver went down the road backwards at speeds that no tank destroyer manual had ever recommended, tracks clawing for grip, and the 88mm round from the Tiger passed over the turret and exploded in the field behind. The Tiger fired again. The second shell hit the road 20 feet from the M36's tracks. Snow and gravel showered the crew. Somebody in the turret was screaming. Somebody else was praying. The driver kept reversing. They lived. Barely. The M36 pulled behind a stone wall and stopped, engine idling, crew shaking. The gunner sat in the freezing wind with his hands on the controls and stared at the tree line and thought about mathematics. He was 22 years old. He had grown up on a farm in Ohio. He had learned to shoot rabbits with a .22 rifle from the porch of his father's house. He understood, in the way that men who have hunted animals understand, that you did not need to shoot a big animal in the strongest part of it. You needed to shoot it where it was weakest. The Tiger's flank armor was 80mm thick. The 90mm could penetrate 80mm at 1,000 yards. The turret ring was thinner still. The engine deck was thinnest of all. He needed the Tiger to turn. That afternoon, in a series of engagements no film crew ever recorded and no cameraman ever photographed, the M36s of the 703rd began to teach themselves the flanking game. They moved in pairs. One vehicle would show itself. The Tiger would traverse toward it. The second M36, positioned to the side, would fire into the exposed flank while the Tiger's gun was still committed to the first target. Then they would move. They would find a new position. They would do it again. The kills came slowly. They came at ranges the report had said were impossible for a frontal shot, but were entirely possible for a side shot. 800 yards. 1,000 yards. 1,200 yards. The 90mm round, striking 80mm armor at 90 degrees, went through and left a hole the size of a coffee cup on the way in and a hole the size of a dinner plate on the way out. Inside, everything burned. The cold was killing them almost as fast as the Germans were. 20 below zero, 25 below at night. In the open turret of an M36, the wind found every seam in every layer of wool. Men wrapped their hands in strips of blanket. They stuffed newspaper into their boots. They took turns crawling down into the hull, where the engine's heat leaked up through the floor and made the difference between fingers that worked and fingers that did not. Frostbite was constant. In the 703rd, more men were evacuated for frozen feet than for combat wounds. Some of them came back missing toes. Some of them came back missing feet. A few of them did not come back at all, having simply gone to sleep on a stalled vehicle in the night and not woken up. They kept fighting. Farther east, at a village called La Glaise, the point of Kampfgruppe Piper's spear was beginning to run out of momentum. Piper's Panthers and Tigers had punched 40 miles into the American lines in 3 days. They had not been stopped. They had not been defeated. They were simply running out of fuel. The King Tigers of the 501st drank gasoline the way a burning house drinks water. Their engines were undersized for their weight. On roads, they consumed a gallon of fuel every 300 or 400 yards. In the mud and snow of the Ardennes, on hills, in low gear, they consumed it faster than that. Piper had been promised captured American fuel dumps. He had not captured them. He had bypassed them, or missed them, or found them destroyed. His own supply column, stretched 50 miles back through the mountains, could not reach him because American engineers had blown the bridges behind him and American aircraft. When the weather broke, tore his fuel trucks apart on the roads. By the 21st of December, King Tigers were dying not from American shells but from empty tanks. Piper's crews were pushing dead machines off the road to keep the column moving. Some of the tanks were being destroyed by their own crews with grenades and explosive charges to keep them out of American hands. Just outside La Glaise, At a place called Werimont Farm, one particular king tiger was about to make its own kind of history. It was Tiger number 213. Its commander was SS Oberscharführer Sova. It was one of the last serviceable king tigers Piper had left, and on the 21st of December, it was defending the eastern approach to La Glaise, positioned on the ground around the farm to cover the road. The battle for the farm was short and vicious. American armor pushed up the road. American infantry closed in through the fields. Tiger 213 took hits, threw a track, lost mobility. Sowa and his crew climbed out. They walked away from the tank they could no longer save. There was no time to destroy it. There was no thermite. There was no fuel to spare for a fire. Tiger 213 sat where it had stopped, engine cooling, hatches open, gun still loaded. It would sit there for the rest of the war. In the years after the war, the tank was recovered and preserved by the local community, remaining in the village square as a silent witness to the battles fought in these hills, moved into the village square and left as a memorial. It sits there still, 80 years later, the last intact King Tiger II in the world. It was not killed by an American gun. It was killed by a narrow Belgian road and an empty fuel tank, and a moment when its own crew ran out of choices. Deeper into La Glaise, the village priest was gathering the last of the villagers into the cellars under the parish church. About 50 Belgians remained in the village, mostly women, children, and the elderly. And they took cover in the substantial stone crypts beneath the church and beneath the largest houses. In one cellar alone, 22 people would spend 6 days and 6 nights while the war tore the roof of their village. Above them, American artillery rounds fell every few minutes. Wounded German soldiers were carried past the doorways. Wounded American prisoners were held in cellars along the same street. Piper's men, the same SS troopers whose comrades had murdered 84 American prisoners at Bognes only days before, walked past the church without breaking down its doors. The reason was never fully explained. Perhaps discipline, perhaps exhaustion, perhaps Piper himself, who set up his command post in the basement of a large stone house nearby, needed the villagers alive as bargaining chips. Perhaps it was simpler than any of that. Perhaps the men were too tired to kill anyone who was not shooting back. Whatever the reason, the villagers of La Glaise lived. When American troops broke into the village on Christmas Eve, the priest opened the cellar doors and led his people up into the daylight. The children blinked at the sun. The mothers stared at the burning ruins of their homes. Somebody was crying. Somebody was laughing. Nobody said anything for a long time. Farther west, the M36s of the 703rd were doing what tank destroyers had always been designed to do. They were killing tanks. At a distance from the King Tiger fight, in an entirely different battle on the plain of the Roa River, a lieutenant named Alfred Rose of the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion made a shot that entered the record books. His gunner laid the sight on a distant Panther tank moving across an open field. The range, according to the after-action report, was 4,600 yards, nearly 2.5 miles. The maximum range of the telescopic sight on the M36. The gunner fired. The shell arced through the winter sky for the better part of 5 seconds. It struck the Panther, and it destroyed the Panther, and it went into the books as the longest confirmed tank kill of the entire war. But the tank Lieutenant Rose killed was a Panther, not a King Tiger. At 2.5 miles, the 90mm could kill the medium tank of the German army. Against the heaviest tank of the German army, it needed to be closer. It needed to hit an angle. It needed to find the seam where the armor was thin. The boys in the open turrets of the 703rd were finding those seams, one at a time, one tank at a time, one frozen hour at a time. By Christmas Eve, Piper's Kampfgruppe was finished. He had lost most of his King Tigers, and most of them had died from empty fuel tanks and blown bridges rather than from 90mm shells. He had lost most of his Panthers to a combination of American armor, American artillery, and American aircraft. He had failed to reach the Meuse. He had failed to reach Antwerp. He had failed at everything the operation had asked him to do. On the night of the 24th of December, in the burning ruins of La Glaise, Piper made a decision. He would abandon every vehicle he still had. He would take his 800 surviving men and he would walk out of the trap on foot, through the American lines, through the woods, in the snow, at 20 below zero, in the dark. His King Tigers would stay behind. His Panthers would stay behind. His half-tracks and trucks and command vehicles would stay behind. Everything that had made Kampfgruppe Piper the sharpest edge of Wacht am Rhein would stay behind, cold and silent, in a Belgian valley that would become their graveyard. The King Tigers had come to the Ardennes to break the American army. The American army had not broken, and out on the ridges, in the tree lines above the empty roads, the ghosts of the 703rd were still watching, still waiting, still hunting. The morning of December 25th, 1944, came to La Glaise in a cold grey silence. American infantry moved into the village at first light. They came slowly, weapons up, expecting a fight. They found none. What they found instead was a graveyard of machines. King Tigers stood in the streets with their engines cold and their fuel tanks empty. Panthers sat in yards and orchards, some with their hatches still open where the crews had climbed out and walked away. Half-tracks blocked intersections. Ammunition trucks smoldered in ditches. The finest armored Kampfgruppe in the German army had left its steel behind and gone home on foot. An American officer counted the vehicles as his men moved through the village. He wrote the numbers down in a notebook, and the numbers would later be argued about in staff reports and in post-war histories, but the outline was clear enough. Piper's Kampfgruppe entered the Ardennes with over 100 tanks and assault guns. By the end of the operation, the vast majority were abandoned, destroyed, or immobilized, leaving the finest armored spearhead in the German army a hollow shell. Most of the King Tigers of the 501st lay in a rough line stretching from the Belgian border to the little bridges of the Amblève Valley, and most of them had been destroyed not by American guns, but by German crews with grenades. Empty fuel tanks, cracked engines, roads too narrow to turn on. The Invincible tanks had been killed by geography and gasoline. At a farmhouse a few miles east, Piper himself had reached German lines late on Christmas morning. He arrived on foot with what remained of his men, roughly 800 survivors from a Kampfgruppe that had crossed the Losheim Gap 10 days earlier, with almost 5,000. He was exhausted. He was frostbitten. He was, by every account of the officers who saw him that morning, a man who understood that he had lost something that would never be given back to him. He was also, though he could not have known it then, a marked man. The photographs of Baugny had already reached American newspapers. The bodies of the 84 murdered prisoners had been photographed in the snow where they fell, frozen into the postures they had died in, some of them still with their hands raised. The pictures had been printed in every paper from New York to San Francisco. Piper's name, his rank, his unit, and the details of what his men had done at the crossroads outside Malmedy were public knowledge before the last of his soldiers had walked back into German lines. The war ended for him 5 months later. He surrendered to American forces in Austria in May of 1945. He was 30 years old. He would spend the rest of his life inside the shadow of Baugny. The trial came in 1946 at a former concentration camp called Dachau. 74 members of Piper's Kampfgruppe stood in the dock. The court found 43 of them, Piper included, guilty of the murder of prisoners of war. 43 men, including Piper, were sentenced to death. None of them was executed. In the years that followed, the death sentences were commuted to life. The life sentences were shortened. Political winds shifted. The Cold War had begun. Germany was no longer the enemy. By the end of the 1950s, every man convicted at Dachau for the Malmedy massacre had walked out of prison a free man. Piper walked out in December of 1956. He was 41 years old. He had served 11 years for the murders of 84 American soldiers. He tried to disappear into civilian life. He worked as a translator. He wrote a memoir he could not get published. He moved from Germany to a small stone house in the village of Traves, in eastern France. In 1972, he grew a vegetable garden. He walked in the woods. Neighbors described him as quiet. In the summer of 1976, on the night of the 13th to the 14th of July, the house in Traves burned to the ground. Investigators found a body in the ashes. Dental records identified it as Joachim Piper. He was 61 years old. No one has ever been charged with his killing. The date is important. He died on the night before Bastille Day, the French national holiday, in a village of a country that had suffered under the SS. Some believed it was French resistance veterans. Some believed it was communists. Some believed the killers had come from across the border. The investigation went nowhere. Piper's ashes were quietly interred and the case was quietly closed. The commander of the King Tigers of the 501st did not live to face any of this. Heinz von Westernhagen had led what remained of his battalion out of Belgium in the last days of December of 1944. His unit had been rebuilt, poorly, for a final offensive in Hungary in the spring of 1945. The offensive failed. The 501st was destroyed a second time in the mud of Lake Balaton. At La Glaise, the King Tiger of SS Oberscharführer Sova, tank number 213, sat where it had stopped near Weremont Farm on the 21st of December. American recovery teams looked at it, admired it, photographed it, and then walked away. Moving it was harder than leaving it. The war moved on. Piper's men were long gone. The war ended. The occupation ended. The Belgians returned. In the years after the war, a local innkeeper's wife walked out to where the tank sat and paid the American salvage crew a bottle of cognac for it. She had it dragged into the village square. She meant it as a memorial. Tank number 213 is still there. It stands today in the town square, a few dozen yards from the church, where the village priest hid his parishioners in the crypt below. It is the last intact King Tiger II in the world. Every year, tourists take photographs of it. Every year, school children walk past it on their way to class. It has not moved since the winter of 1944. The parish priest of La Glaise outlived the tank he had hidden his people from and was buried a short walk from it. The men of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion went on to fight through the reduction of the Bulge in January of 1945, through the drive to the Rhine, across the Great River on an engineer's bridge near Honnef in late March, and eastward into Germany until they reached the Elbe. They ended the war attached, as they had been through most of the winter, to the 3rd Armored Division. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Fred Merriam, brought his battalion home. The unit was deactivated. Most of the men went back to Michigan and Oklahoma and Tennessee, back to farms and factories, and the ordinary lives they had been pulled out of 3 years earlier. They did not talk about the cold much afterward. That was the piece most of them kept private. The gun kills, the burning tanks, the tactical problems solved in fractions of seconds under fire. Those things went into the after-action reports and eventually into the histories. The frostbite, the hands that never worked quite right again, the friends who had gone to sleep on a stalled vehicle and not woken up, those things stayed inside the men who had survived them. The M36 itself outlived the war by decades. When Korea came, in 1950, the American Army pulled M36s out of storage and shipped them east. Against the T-34-85s of the North Korean People's Army, the 90mm gun proved just as decisive as it had been against the Panther. The M36 killed Soviet-built tanks in Korean valleys, the way it had killed German-built tanks in Belgian villages. American aid programs sent surviving M36s to allies around the world. They fought in the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. They fought in Yugoslavia's civil wars in the 1990s, half a century after they had been built. Some of the last M36s still in military service were operated by Balkan armies against enemies who had not been born when the vehicles were manufactured. They were long-lived weapons. Their gun was too good to retire. And yet, in a quiet irony that only military historians tend to notice, the doctrine that had produced the M36 did not survive the war it had won. The American Tank Destroyer branch, with its separate battalions, its distinctive shoulder patches, its aggressive motto of Seek, Strike, Destroy, was dissolved in 1946. The post-war army decided that the future belonged to the main battle tank, a vehicle that would carry the firepower of the M36 inside the protection of a sealed turret. The M26 Pershing, then the M46 Patton, then the M48 and the M60 took over the killing job. The tank destroyer, as a concept, was quietly buried. The gun that had proved the doctrine also outlived the doctrine. The men who had fought inside the doctrine watched it disappear. There is a small thing worth mentioning at the end of all this. The name Ghost Tank does not appear in any American after-action report of the Battle of the Bulge. It does not appear in the newsletters of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Association. It does not appear in the memoirs of the men who fought in the M36s. What they called their vehicle was the Slugger, or the 90, or just the gun. The idea of a ghost tank belongs to a later generation. It belongs to the way stories get told after the men who lived them are gone. But the feeling behind the name is not invented. In the German accounts of the winter of 1944, In the survivor stories of King Tiger crews, who came home to write about what had happened to them, there is a phrase that appears again and again. It is a phrase that appears in the words of men who had gone into the Ardennes convinced that no allied weapon could hurt them, and who had come out having watched their machines die, one by one, on empty roads, at the hands of enemies they had trouble seeing until it was too late. They said, over and over, that they had been killed by ghosts. That part is true. The winter of 1944 ended, as all winters do. The snow melted. The rivers ran. Farmers in the Ardennes returned to their fields and began, slowly, to plow around the wrecked machines. Some of the tanks were dragged away for scrap. Some sank into the earth where they had died. A few, like the King Tiger of SS Oberscharführer Sova, were left as memorials. For a long time after the war, if you drove through the small villages of eastern Belgium, you could still see them. Rusted King Tigers in overgrown lots, Panthers half buried in tree lines, American Sherman tanks with their turrets missing, sitting at country crossroads. The debris of a war fought by men who had frozen and burned and been killed in these hills before most of the people now living had been born. Most of that debris is gone now. The fields are clean. The forests have grown back. La Glaise is quiet again, the way it was quiet before the war. But if you go there, and if you walk to the town square, you can still stand in front of a 70-ton machine that a small group of American boys in open turrets and frozen boots refused to be broken by. You can still put your hand on the cold steel of a tank that was supposed to be invincible and was not. You can still look up at the long gun that pointed at nothing important in the end, and understand that the war it had come to win had been lost, in part, by men whose names are on no memorial and whose faces are in no famous photograph. They were boys from Michigan and Oklahoma and Tennessee. They stood in open turrets at 20 below zero. They knew their guns could not kill the tank from the front. They found another way. And on a cold road in a small country, 80 years ago, they proved that no machine, however heavy, however armored, however proud, is invincible when the men in the open turrets refuse to run.